Hello, SC Whitmore government students. Today's lesson is going to be on federalism. Federalism is an important part of our constitutional republic. When we first tried to create a government under the Articles of Confederation, we created a confederal or a confederation system, and it didn't work. Under a confederation, state governments have a lot of power. And in our case, we found that the state governments had too much power, so much so that the federal government or the national government couldn't get things done. So, when we wrote the Constitution, when we scrapped the Articles of Confederation and we wrote the Constitution, we created a federal system. And so that's what this lesson today is going to be about. It's going to be about federalism and what that actually looks like. It's one of the hallmarks of our country. Now, under a federal system, you have a federal government, you have state governments, and you have local governments. And ultimately, those governments share power. Now, what that actually looks like is what we're going to talk about in the next slide. Ultimately, in a federal system, the federal and state government share power, but ultimately the federal government is supreme. This is called in the Constitution the Supremacy Clause. It's right there in Article 6. It says very clearly that this Constitution and the laws of the United States, blah, 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 shall be the supreme law of the land. That's just a big way of saying that if the federal government creates a law and the state governments create a law that are in conflict, the federal law is supreme. The federal law would rule over or supersede the state and local law. So in our federal system, under federalism, the federal government is the top dog. So if it was a pyramid, the federal government would be at the top. Underneath, you would have the 50 state governments, and then at the bottom, the thousands of local governments. Just to be clear what we're talking about here, when we say federal government, we're talking about the government in Washington, D.C., the one that rules over our entire country. That would be the president, the Congress, the Supreme Court. When we're talking about states, I think we all understand, we're talking about the 50 state governments. So in South Carolina, that would be in Columbia at our state house. We have our state government, which would be the governor, the legislature, the General Assembly is what we call that. And then we have a state Supreme Court. And then local governments, which would be at the bottom, there are thousands of those around the country. That would be the local government where you live. I live in Lexington, so we actually have a town council in Lexington. I also live in the county of Lexington, so it's both a town and a county. And the county of Lexington has a county government. So where you live, that may be the case as well. That would be local governments. Ultimately, the Supreme Court is supreme, excuse me, not the Supreme Court. The federal law is supreme. It is the top dog. Now, when we're talking about the federal government, there are certain kinds of powers that the federal government has. Ones that we specifically know about are called expressed or enumerated powers. The reason they're called that is because they are specifically expressed or listed, enumerated, listed in the Constitution. These are powers that there's no question about because they're specifically listed in the Constitution as federal powers. Some examples are coining money. In other words, only the federal government can make money or can create money. The state of South Carolina can't decide one day that it's just going to print its own kind of money. That's not legal. That's unconstitutional. Only the federal government can do that. So they're in charge of printing our dollars and deciding how much is going to be out there in the system. Only the federal government can raise an army. South Carolina and California and Florida can't decide, you know what, we're going to raise our own armies and we're going to fight our own wars. We can't do that. Only the federal government, led by the president, can raise an army. Things like naturalization standards, who we're going to allow into the country, the process of becoming a citizen, those are federal powers. Regulating trade between the states. So if you have an issue of trade between South Carolina and Nebraska, it's the federal government who comes in and regulates that. And you can see the list there on the chart. There are so many, I think there are 27 specific enumerated powers. I'll have to look that up to be sure, but I think there's something like that. But these are specific powers listed and given to the federal government. Now, here's a spoiler alert about what we're going to talk about a few slides later. Those aren't the only powers the federal government has. They have more, and we're going to talk about how they have more. But the specific ones that there is no dispute over are called enumerated or express powers. Concurrent powers are powers that are shared by the federal and state governments. And those are the powers listed in the middle of the chart. Those are powers that both the federal government and the states and local governments can all do. Things like taxing. So when I get a paycheck, I have both federal tax taken out and I have, unfortunately, state tax taken out. South Carolina takes out state tax. Local taxes are something that can happen. So in Lexington, we have a local restaurant tax, and some of your local towns and counties may have that as well. So all governments, whether it's the federal top government, the state governments, or the local governments, they can all tax. The power to borrow money. South Carolina can borrow money. So can the federal government in Washington, D.C. Enforcing laws. This is something that all the governments can do. All the governments have an executive branch. At the federal level, that's the president. He's in charge of the executive branch. At the state level, that will be the governor. And then local level, you have mayors and town councils. They also can establish courts. So we have federal courts all around the country, but we also have state courts. And in fact, if you've ever dealt with the court system, most of you have probably dealt with state courts, South Carolina state courts. But there are also federal courts that would deal with federal laws. So these are things that we call them concurrent. It means that they share the power, that both the federal and state governments can do these things. Of course, then we have what are called the reserved powers. These are powers that do not belong to the federal government. They are reserved to the states and the local governments. These are things that the federal government doesn't really have control over. Things like public health. I mean, we saw this during the pandemic. You had states, especially in the South, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, they had a very different response to the pandemic than New York, New Jersey, Michigan, California. Each state got to decide how they were going to respond to that. Some states shut things down much more tightly. Other states, like here in South Carolina, were more open and open quicker. And so that was a dispute. We saw that as a dispute. And a lot of people were saying, well, why can't the federal government just have a consistent response across all the states? And the reason is because it's not a federal government power. These are reserved powers to the state. So public health. Education is another one. Very different education systems in California than in South Carolina, or in Michigan than in Florida. And the reason for that is the states get to determine the public education system. They get to determine what kind of education system they want to set up. Now, the truth is, we're way more uniform today than we were 80 years ago. 80 years ago, you had some, or 100 years ago, you had some states that required students to go to school for 180 days. You had other states that didn't have very many requirements at all. But ultimately today we're much more uniform, but there's still differences in funding and things like that. Establishing local governments. Each state gets to determine how they establish local government. Elections. So we talk about controversy. The 2020 presidential election was very controversial. How and where you counted votes, that was very different from state to state. And the reason for that is states had their own way of conducting elections. Some states used to use punch cards. Some states would use paper ballots. We're more uniform now again than we were 20, 30, 40 years ago, but there's still differences. There are big differences. And of course, that can cause disputes. Okay, I told you earlier that The federal government has some specific powers listed in the Constitution that are not in dispute. But then there are other things the federal government can do that are more in dispute, and they are called the implied powers of the federal government. These are powers that are not specifically listed in the Constitution, but are necessary and proper, is what the Constitution says, for the federal government to do its job. So basically, the framers of the Constitution gave the federal government an out. They said, we're going to list specific powers that you have, but we're also going to say that the government has to be able to do things that are necessary and proper. And because they have to be able to do those things, the federal government can imply certain powers. Let me give an example. So we know that the federal government has the ability to raise an army. That's a very specific right listed in the Constitution. In order to do that, the federal government in the past, we don't have this today, but in the past, the federal government has created a draft where you draft soldiers into the military. Another example is the federal government has the power to collect taxes. Well, one of the things the federal government has done to help collect taxes is create the IRS, the Internal Revenue System, which basically can audit you, can come and investigate you or investigate a business and determine, are you paying the taxes that you're supposed to be paying? Minimum wage. All right, so the Congress, the federal government has a power to regulate commerce, to regulate trade between states. So one of the things that the federal government has implied is that they then have a right to have a minimum wage. What you'll notice about these implied powers, though, is that each implied power has a specific expressed power that goes with it. So for instance, raising an army is the express power. Drafting soldiers is the implied power. Collecting taxes is the express power. Creating the IRS is the implied power. Regulating commerce is the express power. Creating a minimum wage is the implied power. And so Congress and the federal government over the years has actually implied a lot of power. Now, whether they have that power or not, that's ultimately have been up to the courts to decide whether that is actually a power or not. For the most part, the courts have ruled that the federal government does have the powers that they imply. But occasionally, they've said no. You know, there's been a Supreme Court case. In fact, there was a very famous Supreme Court case of a federal law that dealt with guns in schools. Well, we know that all states have laws against guns in schools, but this one student brought a gun to school and got a federal law. They said he broke a federal law and therefore went to federal court. Well, he sued and said the federal government doesn't have any right to do that. And the Supreme Court actually agreed with the student. They said that the federal government doesn't have the right to involve itself in schools. That states can do that, and of course all states have banned guns in schools, but the federal government can't do that. So occasionally the courts will rule that the implied powers that the federal government say they have, they don't really have. But for the most part, the courts have ruled that if the government says it's an implied power, the federal government says it's an implied power, then they do have that power. You can see in the political cartoon there, state legislatures kicking big old Uncle Sam. In other words, it's like a little gnat bothering Uncle Sam, and it says, "Take that, you evil tyrant! Take that, that." In other words, they don't. What this political cartoon is saying is that the federal government is huge and can't be stopped, and state legislatures, state governments can try, but they really aren't doing anything to the federal government. There's a lot of truth in that, but of course it's not completely true. I just gave you an example of where state power had trumped federal power, but most of the time it does not. All right, the last thing we need to talk about is inherent power. So not only do the federal government has expressed powers, those are specifically listed in the Constitution. The federal government has implied powers, things that they can imply based on the expressed powers. But the federal government also has something called inherent powers. And these are powers that the government has simply to function as a government. Things like controlling borders. So that's not specifically listed in the Constitution. It's also not implied from any of the express powers, but it is something that every government everywhere has to be able to do. It has to be able to manage its borders. So the idea of building a wall on the border or whatever it may be, that would be an inherent power that the federal government would have, and it would be very difficult to say the federal government doesn't have that power because it's inherent to all governments. Things like acquiring new land. Now, we don't do as much of that anymore, but back when we first started the country, we increased in size rapidly. One example is the Louisiana Purchase. Thomas Jefferson, as the third president, he bought an area of land called Louisiana. It was a huge area of land, of course, not just the state Louisiana. It was a huge area of land. It doubled the size of our country. And a lot of people back then wondered, did the president have the ability to do that? Well, Jefferson would argue it was his inherent power. It's the inherent power of any government to acquire new land. And there are other types of inherent power that you can research on your own. But the idea is, I want you to understand that just because it's not listed in the Constitution doesn't mean the federal government doesn't have that power. So in other words, the federal government has specific powers listed, but they also have taken other powers over the years, either through implied powers or through inherent powers. That doesn't mean that the federal government can do whatever it wants whenever it wants, because we do have reserved powers for the state and local governments. And over the years, the courts have ruled sometimes that the federal government goes too far. It's not often, but it does rule that way. So that's what our federal system is all about. Federal, state, and local governments. Some people believe that the states should have more power, that the Constitution actually intended for states to have more power than they have. Other people argue that the federal government was always intended to be way more powerful than even it is today. That's something you're going to have to decide on your own, and it's something that we debate in politics even in 2022. Have a great day.